This was never a misunderstanding. It was never confusing. And it definitely was never just bad communication. This was a line crossed deliberately, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Because when money moves quietly, when signatures happen without witnesses, and when one person is suddenly powerless while everyone else walks away intact, that's not family dysfunction. That's a scheme. And tonight, we are calling it what it is. Because Meri Brown did not imagine this. She did not exaggerate it. And she is not lying. Someone did something behind her back, and now everyone involved is scrambling to rewrite the story. For months, we've been told there was no backdoor deal, that nothing improper happened, that the property sale was inevitable, fair, and forced. But here's the problem with that narrative. The paperwork doesn't agree. The timing doesn't agree. And the money trail absolutely does not agree. And when three people all insist they're innocent while one person loses, everything history tells us something very different happened. Now sit with that for a second. Because if this really was clean, why does everyone sound defensive? Why does every explanation contradict the last? And why does Meri's version suddenly make more sense the more details come out? And that is where this story actually begins. Welcome back, Sister Wives Now. And before anyone jumps into the comments saying this is just bitterness or old drama, let me be very clear. This is not about feelings. This is about power, paperwork, and who got cut out when it mattered most. Because the moment you remove emotion from this story, what's left is a trail of decisions that consistently benefit the same two people, while the same woman keeps being told to accept less, stay quiet, and be grateful for scraps. So let's talk about the lie first. There was no backdoor deal. That sentence has been repeated so many times it's almost hypnotic. Janelle says it. Kody says it sometimes. Robyn pretends she doesn't even understand the question. And yet, somehow, ownership changed. Percentages shifted. Control consolidated. And Meri was no longer in a position to stop anything. That does not happen by accident. And insiders, people who understand how property agreements work, people who have actually read similar filings will tell you the same thing. You don't accidentally give up leverage. You don't accidentally sign documents that restructure power. You don't accidentally create a majority that didn't exist before. Someone benefits. Someone authorizes it. And someone gets locked out. And that someone was Meri. What makes this worse, and this is where viewers are getting angry, is that Meri didn't just lose land. She lost voice. She lost choice. She lost the ability to say no. And the moment that happened, everything that followed became inevitable. Social media saw it immediately. Comments flooded in. Why does Meri always get the short end? Why does Robyn end up protected every single time? Why is Janelle acting like this wasn't a big deal? And here's the thing, viewers aren't stupid. They know when they're being slow-walked into accepting a bad explanation. They know when a story is being sanitized. And the louder the denial gets, the more people start asking the question everyone's dancing around. If there was no deal, then why did Meri have no say? Because let's strip this down to its simplest truth. Meri believed she had an equal stake. Meri believed decisions required her consent. Meri believed she had time. And while she believed that, decisions were being made without her. That's not miscommunication. That's strategy. And if you listen carefully, really carefully, you can hear it slipping through the cracks during the tell-alls, during the interviews, during the moments when Kody gets defensive and Janelle gets vague and Robyn suddenly forgets entire conversations. The language changes. The tone shifts. Responsibility gets blurred. And Meri, she's left trying to explain something that already happened. That's the tell. Because people who didn't do anything wrong don't rush to minimize outcomes. They don't say things like it didn't matter anyway or it was going to happen regardless. That's not how innocence talks. That's how justification sounds. And this is where the emotional weight hits viewers hard, because so many people watching recognize this pattern. Being the last to know, being told it's not a big deal after the damage is done, being reassured while the floor is quietly pulled out from under you. You can feel it in Meri's voice. Not rage, not yet. It's disbelief. The kind that comes from realizing you trusted the wrong people for too long. And the cruelest part, she was trusting trusting people who benefited from that trust. Now let's address the elephant everyone keeps pretending isn't in the room, Robyn. Because if Robyn truly had nothing to do with this, if she was genuinely unaware, then her position at the end of this makes no sense. You don't just wake up one day with increased security, increased protection, and increased ownership without being part of the conversation. That's not how real life works. That's not how legal structures work. And that's not how marriage works, especially not a marriage where assets have been tightly controlled for years. Yet somehow, every outcome favors her. Every risk bypasses her. Every sacrifice belongs to someone else. And we're supposed to believe that's coincidence. Viewers aren't buying it. And frankly, neither are people who understand how these deals function. Because what happened here required alignment. It required agreement. And it required at least one person willing to move forward knowing someone else would be upset but powerless. Which brings us to Janelle. This is where the betrayal feels personal for a lot of fans. Because Janelle wasn't just another party. She was the one who promised she'd stand with Meri. She was the one who positioned herself as fair, logical, numbers-driven, the smart one, the financially responsible one. And that's exactly why this hurts more. Because someone who understands numbers understands the consequences. Someone who understands property understands leverage. And someone who signs without looping in another stakeholder understands exactly what that means. That's why the denial rings hollow. Because the argument isn't was the sale forced. The argument is who made it unavoidable. And by the time Meri realized what was happening, the math was already against her. The structure had already changed. The decision had already been made. That's not a family discussion. That's a lockout. And this is where the tone of the story shifts, because this is no longer about land in Arizona. This is about a pattern of waiting until Meri is emotionally invested, financially exposed, and legally vulnerable, and then moving forward without her. Fans feel it. You can see it in reaction videos, comment threads, live chats where people are practically yelling at their screens saying, "Why does this keep happening to her?" Because the answer is uncomfortable. It keeps happening because it works. It works when one person avoids conflict. It works when one person believes promises. It works when one person assumes good faith in people who are quietly acting in their own interest. And once that realization sets in, once Meri fully understands that this wasn't bad luck, the anger makes sense. The distance makes sense. The silence makes sense. Because you don't argue with people who already won. You expose them. And that's exactly what this feels like now. Not revenge. Not drama. Exposure. And the reason this story isn't going away, the reason it keeps resurfacing, is because no one involved has offered a clean, consistent explanation that accounts for every outcome. They've explained pieces. They've redirected blame. They've minimized loss. But they haven't explained why Meri ended up with less power than she started with, and that's the part that haunts this entire situation. Because once power shifts quietly, everything else is just damage control. And that's where we're headed. Here's the part they didn't expect anyone to slow down enough to notice. Money doesn't move emotionally, it moves strategically. And once you start tracking when it moved, who needed it to move, and how fast it suddenly had to happen, the story stops sounding like a family falling apart and starts sounding like people making decisions under financial pressure and deciding who was expendable. Because desperation has a smell, and this situation reeks of it. Behind the calm voices and that this was inevitable language, there was a clock ticking, bills stacking, credit tightening, and obligations that don't care about feelings or plural family philosophy. And when that clock gets loud enough, morals get flexible. That's where insiders start raising eyebrows. People familiar with property restructures will tell you this. Nobody rushes a land deal unless they have to. You wait for appraisals. You test the market. You negotiate. You protect your position. Unless time is the enemy. Unless the goal isn't maximum value, it's immediate relief. And that's exactly what this looked like. Because the moment ownership percentages shifted, the urgency changed. Suddenly, speed mattered more than price. Silence mattered more than consensus. And the person who used to be able to say no was no longer invited into the room. That's not a coincidence. That's sequencing. Viewers caught it too. You could feel the temperature rise online when people started connecting dots, not emotionally, but logically. TikTok breakdowns, Reddit threads, commenters freezing frames and replaying statements side by side. One fan wrote, "Why does every explanation start after Meri loses leverage?" Another asked, "If this was fair, why did it need to happen so quietly?" Good questions, uncomfortable questions, and notice how no one answers them directly. Instead, we get language like we had no choice. The market forced us. It was complicated. Everyone agreed. Those phrases are shields. They sound reasonable. Until you ask the follow-up, who agreed, when, and with what information? Because agreement without full information isn't agreement. It's compliance. And Meri didn't comply. She was bypassed. This is where the emotional validation hits home for so many viewers. Because people watching recognize this pattern from their own lives. The meeting you weren't invited to. The decision you were informed about after it was final. The moment you realized my input was never actually required. That sting. That's what people hear in Meri's voice now. And once you hear it, you can't pretend this is just fitness. Let's talk about the financial pressure point everyone keeps dancing around. Debt. Not abstract debt. Real, pressing obligations. The kind that don't wait for filming schedules or family discussions. The kind that demands liquidity. And when liquidity is scarce, assets become targets. Land becomes leverage. And if you control the vote, you control the outcome. That's why restructuring ownership matters so much. Because once you have a majority, you don't need consensus. You need compliance. And if someone doesn't comply, you move forward anyway. People close to similar deals will tell you that's the whole point. And that's why the denial of a backdoor deal feels insulting to the audience's intelligence. Because nobody is alleging secret handshakes in dark rooms. They're pointing at paperwork, timing, power shifts, the kind of deal that happens in daylight as long as you don't look too closely. Which brings us back to Robyn, because this is where the emotional temperature spikes. Robyn's positioning throughout this entire saga has been strategic innocence. Confused, overwhelmed, detached, as if these outcomes simply landed on her lap. And yet, her household emerges the most insulated from risk every single time. Fans have noticed. They're not subtle about it anymore. She always ends up protected. How does she never lose? Why is everyone else sacrificing for her stability? These aren't casual questions. They're accusations wrapped in frustration. Because here's the thing, ignorance doesn't produce benefits consistently. In real life, the person who gains the most usually knows what's happening, or at the very least, doesn't ask questions they don't want answered. And silence can be participation. What makes this hit harder is the contrast between what was said and what happened. Viewers were told this was about fairness, about equality, about shared sacrifice. But the outcome tells a different story, one where sacrifice flowed in one direction and security flowed in another. And that's when moral outrage kicks in. Because fairness isn't measured by intent, it's measured by impact. And the impact here is undeniable. Meri lost control. Janelle lost credibility. And Robyn lost the benefit of the doubt. Let's be very clear about Janelle's role, because this is where longtime fans feel betrayed. Janelle has always been framed as the pragmatic one, the numbers person, the realist, the one who sees the big picture. And that's exactly why her participation, active or passive, feels like a breach of trust. Because pragmatism without ethics becomes opportunism. When viewers hear Janelle say things like it was unavoidable or there was no other option, they don't hear logic, they hear rationalization. Especially when those statements come after the power shift, not before. Because if there truly was no other option, transparency would have helped, inclusion would have helped, timing would have helped. Instead, everything happened in a way that ensured Meri's resistance came too late. And that's the part people can't get past. Because once the deal was done, everyone acted like Meri was overreacting. Like like she should just accept it, like her anger was inconvenient. And that response, the minimization, is what confirms to viewers that something was wrong. Because you don't dismiss the pain of someone you treated fairly. You dismiss the pain of someone you outmaneuvered. Social media reaction has been brutal and telling. Why does Kody sound angrier about being questioned than about Meri being hurt? Why does Robyn cry about stress but not about what Meri lost? Why does Janelle keep saying it's complicated instead of we should have included her? Those questions linger because they're never answered. And here's where Kody's role becomes impossible to ignore, because leadership means accountability. And instead of owning the outcome, Kody does what he's done for years: deflects, blames communication, blames timing, blames other people's emotions. Anything except the structure he helped create. But here's the reality. Structures don't build themselves. Someone approves them. Someone signs off. Someone decides who gets informed and who doesn't. And that someone was him. Which is why his anger feels defensive, not righteous. It's the anger of someone who knows the argument doesn't hold up under scrutiny. The anger of someone who wants the conversation to move on before the audience connects the last dot. But the audience already has. And that's why this story refuses to die. Because once viewers realize this wasn't a single bad decision, but a chain of decisions, the moral clarity sharpens. This wasn't chaos. It was direction. It wasn't confusing. It was prioritization. And Meri was not the priority. That realization hits like a gut punch, especially for longtime fans who watched her compromise, stay loyal, and believe promises long after others walked away. For years, she was told patience would pay off, that loyalty mattered, that her turn would come. Instead, the door quietly closed, and when she finally knocked, everyone acted surprised she was standing outside. This is why the audience's sympathy has shifted so decisively. Because people can forgive mistakes. They can forgive bad communication. They can even forgive selfishness. What they can't forgive is systematic exclusion. And that's what this feels like now. Not a misunderstanding. Not a disagreement. A system that worked exactly as intended for everyone except the person who trusted it most. And as this continues to unravel, one thing is becoming clear. The truth didn't come out because they wanted it to. It came out because it couldn't stay buried anymore. And we're still not at the bottom, because the next layer isn't about what happened. It's about why it had to happen that way, and what was at risk if it didn't. That's where things get uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. Here's where the story stops being about land and starts being about fear. Because once you strip away the excuses, the legal jargon, the it was complicated fog, you're left with motive. And motive is always emotional before it's financial. People don't rush deals like this unless something is closing in on them. Something that can't wait. Something that threatens control. This wasn't about maximizing profit. This wasn't about fairness. This was about containment. Containment of risk. Containment of exposure. Containment of voices that could slow things down. And Meri's voice was the loudest risk of all. Insiders familiar with high-conflict asset divisions will tell you something very blunt. The most dangerous person in any deal is the one who no longer needs approval. The one who's emotionally detached but legally entitled. The one who starts asking questions instead of seeking reassurance. That's who Meri became, and the moment she became that, the urgency escalated. Think about the timeline. For years, nothing moved. Delays, excuses. We'll figure it out later. But suddenly, everything needed to happen now. Agreements finalized, ownership restructured, decisions made with speed that bordered on reckless. That kind of acceleration only happens when someone realizes the window is closing. Because here's the truth nobody wants to say out loud. Once Meri fully understood her leverage, the entire structure was at risk. Not emotionally, legally, and legality doesn't care about family narratives or public sympathy. It cares about signatures, percentages, and process. And process is exactly what was bypassed. Viewers picked up on this shift instinctively. You can hear it in the comments, not rage, but clarity. People saying things like, why now? Why all at once? Why does this feel rushed? Because it was rushed. And rushed decisions leave fingerprints. Let's talk about the silence, because silence is louder than any confession. confession. Notice who didn't fight publicly for transparency. Notice who didn't demand open market listing. Notice who didn't insist on independent appraisal. Those are not neutral omissions. Those are strategic absences. If the deal was fair, sunlight would have helped it. If the deal was clean, scrutiny wouldn't matter. If the deal was equal, inclusion would have been automatic. But instead, we got opacity. We got closed conversations. We got decisions presented as facts accomplish. And when Meri reacted, not with hysteria, not with theatrics, but with pointed anger, she was framed as difficult, emotional, unreasonable. That framing is intentional. Because once you paint someone as irrational, you don't have to address their facts. And Meri had facts. That's the part that rattled them. You can hear it in how the tone shifts when she speaks now. There's no pleading, no bargaining, no help me understand. There's resolve. And that scares people who benefited from her patience. Social media clocked it immediately. She's not asking, she's stating. She sounds done. That's not confusion. That's realization. And realization is dangerous. Because once someone realizes they were systematically sidelined, they stop caring about keeping the peace. They start caring about setting the record straight. Which brings us to the attempted narrative control. Watch how quickly the story became about miscommunication instead of misallocation, about hurt feelings instead of financial impact. That shift isn't accidental, it's defensive, because feelings can be dismissed. Numbers cannot. And every time someone tried to minimize Meri's anger, it only validated it. Let's be very honest here. If someone took $500,000 from you through procedural maneuvering, you would not be calm. You would not be polite. You would not be grateful for explanations that arrive after the fact. You would be furious. And viewers know that. That's why the audience stopped asking, is Meri exaggerating? And started asking, why is everyone else so calm about this? Because calm in the face of injustice doesn't read as maturity. It reads as relief. Relief that the deal went through. Relief that resistance came too late. Relief that the consequences are already locked in. That's not peace. That's closure for the people who benefited. And then there's Robyn's role again, because avoidance has a pattern. Every time the conversation gets close to accountability, Robyn retreats into emotional overwhelm, tears, stress, confusion. It's a shield that works because it shifts the focus. Suddenly, the audience is asked to comfort instead of question. But here's the problem. Outcomes don't lie. You don't accidentally end up with the strongest position in every scenario. You don't repeatedly benefit from misunderstandings. At some point, coincidence collapses under its own weight. Fans see it now. They see how Robyn's household was insulated while others were exposed. How urgency applied everywhere except where it would have threatened her security. How the fallout never lands where the benefit accumulates. And silence, again, becomes deafening. Because if she truly didn't know, outrage would follow. Shock would follow. Advocacy would follow. Instead, we got distance. And distance is telling. Janelle's situation is more complicated, and that's why it hurts more. Because betrayal doesn't always look like malice. Sometimes it looks like self-preservation at the expense of someone else's trust. Viewers aren't blind to her grief. They aren't heartless about her losses. But empathy doesn't erase accountability. And pain doesn't excuse participation. The hardest truth for longtime fans to accept is this: Janelle didn't have to lead the charge. She just had to not step aside. And she stepped aside. Whether out of exhaustion, fear, or prioritization, she allowed a process that excluded Meri to move forward. And once that happened, intent stopped mattering. Impact took over. That's why the phrase backdoor deal resonates so deeply. Not because it implies secrecy, but because it implies exclusion by design. A door you don't even know exists until it's already closed behind you. And Meri found herself locked out of a decision that altered her financial future after years of being told she was still family. That's the emotional betrayal audiences can't shake, because loyalty was the currency she paid in and silence was the return. As this continues unfolding, one thing becomes painfully clear. This wasn't about resolving the past. It was about securing the future for some. And the cost of that security was pushed onto someone who had already given more than she ever got back. Which raises the question no one wants to answer yet. What happens when Meri stops protecting the story? Because the truth is, this version, the one we're hearing now, is still restrained, still careful, still measured. And if this is what it sounds like when she's holding back, imagine what comes out when she doesn't feel obligated to anymore. That's the tension hanging over all of this. Because once the silence breaks completely, there's no going back to we didn't know or it just happened. And some people are clearly terrified of that moment. This is the part where the story stops belonging to them and starts belonging to the audience. Because once the final pieces fall into place, there's no neutral ground left. No comfortable middle where intentions matter more than outcomes. What remains is the consequence. And consequences don't care how hard something was or how emotional everyone felt while it was happening. They care about who benefited and who paid the price. By now, viewers aren't debating if something went wrong. They're debating how long it was allowed to go on. Because patterns only become invisible when people refuse to name them. And once named, they're impossible to ignore. What makes this situation so unsettling isn't just the money, it's the normalization of exclusion. The way decisions were framed as inevitable. The way dissent was treated was an inconvenience. The way one voice could be overridden while others were amplified. That's not family chaos. That's hierarchy. And hierarchy is the opposite of everything this family claimed to stand for. Kody's leadership collapses completely under that lens. Not because he made a bad call, but because he created an environment where bad calls didn't need consent, where authority replaced collaboration, where loyalty was expected, but accountability was optional. You can hear it in how he speaks now: defensive, short-tempered, dismissive, the language of someone who knows the moral high ground is gone, so volume becomes the substitute. Viewers don't miss that shift. When did he start sounding like he was managing assets instead of people? He talks like a CEO, not a husband. That's not leadership. That's damage control. And damage control only happens when damage is real. Robyn's position, too, is no longer protected by ambiguity. The audience has moved past maybe she didn't know. They're asking a harsher question now. What did she allow to happen once she did? Because innocence isn't just about ignorance. It's about response. And the response here was comfort with the outcome, acceptance, silence, and silence in moments like this isn't neutral. It's alignment. Janelle's reckoning is quieter but heavier. She may not have orchestrated the deal, but she enabled the conditions that made it irreversible. And the pain viewers feel watching her isn't anger, it's disappointment. Because disappointment comes from expectation. And people expected better. They expected the woman who understood numbers to protect fairness. They expected the voice of reason to slow the process down. They expected solidarity to mean something when it mattered. Instead, they watched survival instincts override principle. And that's a hard thing to witness, especially when it costs someone else their security. Meri's transformation is the emotional center of all of this. Not because she's louder now, but because she's clearer. There's no confusion left in her tone. No hope that things will work out. Just acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that what was taken won't be returned. Acknowledgement that trust won't be repaired. Acknowledgement that the version of family she believed in no longer exists. And viewers feel that loss with her because they watched her wait, compromise, stay, believe, and when the final test came, the moment where fairness could have been proven, she was sidelined. That's not just betrayal. That's erasure. And erasure leaves scars. What makes this ominous isn't the past, it's the future. Because unresolved injustice doesn't disappear. It settles. It calcifies. And eventually, it resurfaces in ways no one can control. Whether through legal action, public disclosure, or simply a refusal to protect protect anyone else's narrative. The reason this story won't die is because it represents something bigger than one family. It represents what happens when power consolidates quietly, when loyalty is weaponized, when transparency is treated as optional. People recognize that they've lived it. That's why the outrage feels personal. Why do comments read like testimony? Why viewers aren't just watching, they're judging. And judgment, once formed, doesn't easily reverse. The most haunting part, this didn't need to happen. There were moments where fairness was possible, where inclusion could have changed everything, where slowing down would have preserved trust. Those moments have passed, and now all that's left is fallout. Because money can be divided, land can be sold. But once people see how they were treated when it mattered most, they don't forget. And neither does the audience. So as this chapter closes, the question isn't whether Meri was right to be angry. The question is how much more there is that hasn't been said yet, and what happens when it finally is. Because truth has a way of surfacing when silence no longer serves anyone. And when it does, it rarely lands gently. If this breakdown gave voice to what you've been feeling, hit like it tells the algorithm this conversation matters. Subscribe if you want accountability-driven coverage without sugarcoating. Turn on the bell so you don't miss what comes next. And most importantly, drop your thoughts in the comments because this story isn't over, and the more people paying attention, the harder it becomes to rewrite history.